Good afternoon, everybody. Firstly, just in case you're wondering why I'm completely wet, I feel a bit of a charlatan standing in front of you today at a disaster preparedness seminar. Actually, blatantly obvious that I do know very little about disaster preparedness because I'm soaking wet. Let me say, very pleased that we are here today from the Sphere project. Very happy to be here at the global platform on disaster risk reduction. We're going to talk for the next 15 minutes about the Sphere project, and the team that we've brought together to do this presentation today is very much representative of what the Sphere project is all about. We have Anita here from WWF.
Ladies and gentlemen,
We have Catherine.
The summary of the midterm review is due to start in 15 minutes. Please make your way to room number 2 and take your seat.
We have Catherine here from Christian Aid.
Madame et Monsieur, la séance première informelle de l'examen à mi-parcours va commencer en 15 minutes.
Yeah. Myself, my name is Martin Fisher from the Sphere Project Office, and Cecilia at the back also from the Sphere Project Office. So together we're going to introduce the Sphere Project. It's actually a very opportune time as well now, having 3 weeks ago we launched the latest, the third edition of the Sphere Handbook, which I've got here now in front of me. So 3 weeks ago we launched this in Delhi, London, New York, Melbourne, among cities around the world. And the next launch will be in the end of June, which will be in Spanish, French and Russian. Now, the launch, the handbook was revised in order to make it very relevant to the humanitarian context that we're facing today in 2011. This means, amongst other things, as we've been at a conference like this, bringing in aspects of the environmental awareness, climate change, disaster risk reduction. Some of those were already included in previous editions, but they've been much more reinforced for now. The revision process also brought together, as we'll see from the people represented today, it brought together experts from a variety of domains, including from Christian Aid and from WWF, in cross-cutting themes across the handbook. Before I hand over to my colleagues who will give more information about these environmental changes and disaster risk reduction, I would just like to focus on 2 things. The first of them being that Sphere project is much more than just the handbook which I have here. It's much about the commitment to working together and in a collaborative process, which has been brought together by seeing how agreement with the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, NGOs and the United Nations can pull this together. The second thing is about the core standard which the Sphere project is built upon. And as we've seen in this forum in the last couple of days, the discussions on assessment, evidence-based and collaboration of working together. Okay.
Thank you, Martin. So, as Martin said, I'm Catherine Nightingale. I'm here from Christian Aid, and I'm here sort of representing my colleague Nigel Timmons, who generously volunteered me for this role. Nigel played a key part of the working group with Anita and others in advising Sphere on what it needed to do to really reinforce and strengthen the approach and to integrate particularly disaster risk reduction, climate change. As you'll see here, I mean, as the final points that Martin were making was that, you know, environmental issues were considered in the original Sphere in 2004, but believe it or not, disaster risk reduction and climate change weren't particularly evident, and that was clearly something that needed to change. So the bit that many of you will be waiting for, I'm sure, is how were DRR concerns included? Well, firstly, one of the key things was that recognising and supporting local capacity had to become part of Sphere. So we had to move from needs assessments alone, and very much a language about needs assessment, into language around vulnerability and capacity analysis, and particularly looking at participatory vulnerability and capacity analysis. It's also about recognising that primary responders are local people and institutions. So many of you will probably know that the Sphere approach and perhaps the fact that needed to be strengthened. There needed to be a recognition and a development of the capacity of local organisations as coming through those new Sphere standards and the process that those standards requires. That key point that Martin was making there, that it's not just a sort of a list of standards, it's about an approach to the work. So we wanted to make the role with first responders and the local organisations a key part of that approach. It's also about ensuring that the recovery process considers vulnerability to multiple hazards and not just the hazard that the particular community is now responding to. So an example of that is very prevalent in our work in Haiti was that even in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, there was a need to consider the multiple hazards that Haiti were facing in the context of emerging typhoon seasons. It's an area that already has to deal with tremendous amounts of tropical storm. There's a tremendous amount of vulnerability. So there's a need there, if you think about Haiti as an example of that, to be considering the multiple hazards it was going to be at risk of. Other DRR concerns that were included was about recognising and supporting positive coping mechanisms. In the original Sphere, and I think this is something that Nigel really picked up on, the 2004 version saw coping mechanisms more as an indicator of failure, of weakness, rather than as a basis to be built upon. That coping mechanisms were the work of primary responders and their first efforts to respond, so they needed to be seen as assets that could be built upon. And also by being led by the nature of the support that communities request, rather than arriving with preconceived ideas about what they need. So one of the key things to think about in the context, again, perhaps of Haiti, but also elsewhere, has been the importance and the growing recognition of the role of cash and cash-based transfer systems as a way of ensuring that local communities have the power to decide their immediate most pressing needs, and working with them obviously in different ways to do that. And there is in the new Sphere version, there's a much more developed analysis of cash transfer and its use. Finally, I guess I wanted to touch on that the new approach to Sphere had to include a better disaster response that comes from better disaster preparedness. And this particularly came out through the nutrition chapter. So previously, Sphere was perhaps overly emphasised on the standards of response and not necessarily on what the core preparedness elements, particularly, for example, in preparing for food distribution, food security issues, that could be put in place. So those were the key areas that were perhaps included for this. I'm going to hand over now to Anita.
How do we move this forward? Okay. So my name is Anita Van Breda. I work with World Wildlife Fund in Washington, D.C. And as Catherine mentioned, Nigel Timmons was my co-focal point for this process. But we were not the experts on this issue for this process. We were just representing our working group, which also then involved engagement and consultation with many multiple individuals and agencies. So it was definitely a group and a collaborative process. And because of a limited time, I'm not going to go through all of the environmental issues that we addressed. I just wanted to put up a few that I think are important and relevant for going forward. But the easiest win and the most obvious one was the new handbook is green. So that I took that as an environmental win for the future. But in serious analysis, assessments, and including environmental issues at the very earliest stages of disaster response, and including environmental processes in the assessments that take place. And also recognizing that the core standards, where some of the foundation for the way forward is addressed, is a very important place to include environmental issues. Analysis of the context is something that we tried to stress throughout, and not just a focus on specific indicators and specific quantities, but also being able to look at what's the underlying resource base, and can it actually support those indicators, or are adjustments required. Procurement, looking at building materials and where they come from, and being able to follow the chain of custody to understand that we're actually looking for both legal and sustainable materials where that's possible and appropriate. Shelter there was a sense that we can reduce environmental impacts by having smaller camps or groups of shelter spread out over a large area, when actually in some situations it's better to have fewer number, maybe larger in scale, but better managed camps and shelter areas in order to reduce the environmental footprint of those places. And climate change, that was a real difficult one in this process, and one that I look forward to in the next Sphere revision, having a little bit more understanding and ability to include climate change in Sphere, because it's a very challenging issue. So the fact that it's there now is good. I think we can do better the next time around. But it's certainly something that we're going to be looking at over the next couple of years, and looking how agencies use Sphere and how we can address climate change in future revision processes. So those are just a couple of examples of how we try to build upon the former version of Sphere, and also think to the next revision process and how we can learn from how it's used in order to improve for the future. So with that, on behalf of my colleagues, I thank you for your attention and would welcome questions, comments for any of us. It's all perfectly clear. Right.
Yep. The two addresses there, the first one is the Sphere Project website. If you go there, you can find a lot of information, not just on the revision process or the handbook, but also about learning, training opportunities. Obviously, now that we have the new version, there's been an increased interest in the Sphere project, which we're now trying to meet through a new learning strategy, revised training modules around the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe, North America. So those learning opportunities are there. We're also looking at e-learning, online collaboration platforms, basically to try to get as many people in the humanitarian and development sector aware of the Sphere project, the handbook, and as a force and a tool which can actually improve the quality and accountability of the work that we're doing. Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I came in about 2 or 3 minutes late. One has to be very precise here, like a Swiss watch. So you maybe covered this. To what extent in this revision have you tried to incorporate guidelines for doing, for instance, participatory planning with communities? There is now a critical mass of experience among many of the hundreds of partners in kind of what works, what doesn't work. Also, ethical issues associated with this kind of research and planning, risk mapping, ownership, etc. Have you made a start at that? Have you? Because ultimately it might require a kind of parallel sister publication, but I mean, have you at least marked out space for that?
Okay, just very briefly. I mean, there's two things that I'll refer you to. One is the core standards, which are the 6 core standards. The first one being people-centered humanitarian response. That brings in and puts the case for why it's very important to have people-centered. About coordination and collaboration, assessment, design. Yes, it's there. Also, other publications and other tools are name-checked and referred to. Good examples like the Good Enough Guide, those about actually how to do participatory planning process. So it is there, yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just add there are a lot of good references, so you can dig a little bit deeper into some of those issues, and that is a real challenge that was for the revision team as well, because it's not meant to be a blueprint or a how-to manual. So that's kind of the tension in the process, yeah.
Any more questions? Any quick ones? We have leaflets which will tell you, again, if you go to the first website, we can, it tells you how you can order the books. There's 2 places where you can order them from, which you have to pay for. We gave out thousands. We gave out a lot during the launches. And I'm sure we will do it the next series of launches as well in Spanish, French, and Russian. Okay, thank you very much.